I'm Sarah Posner with Religion Dispatches, and my guest today is Natan Sachs. He's a fellow at the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution and an expert on Middle East affairs. And we're going to talk today about a piece he published recently in the journal Foreign Affairs with Daniel Byman called The Rise of Settler Terrorism. And in the piece, you and your co-author urge the use of the term terrorism as applied to settlers in the West Bank who engage in violent or intimidating acts against Palestinians. And there's been some discussion within Israeli leadership of labeling this sort of activity as terrorism. Has there been any discussion of it at all among American policymakers, or is it too politically charged to even discuss it?
No, actually, the State Department has repeatedly in recent years, referred to these kinds of attacks as terrorist acts, and they report on them within the context of terrorism reporting. We're talking about the actual designation of individuals or organizations as terrorists, which is a step further and has legal ramifications in terms of law enforcement and the ability to use, especially to stop funds from being sent to these people. But I should clarify that we're talking about a subset of people of these acts. So a lot of the violence that we see is not necessarily exactly terrorism. It is more hooliganism or vandalism. And we're talking about a subset of cases that really do fit the classical definition of terrorism, not because of their sensationalism or not because that they're nearly as bad as what we would usually call terrorism, such as suicide bombings or worse, but because the method is an attempt to use psychological means, terror, to affect a political change within an adversary. And so what some of these people are doing is using violence against innocents, against officially innocent people that even they would recognize as such, calling it a price tag, in Hebrew tag mechir, and that price tag is a cost associated with something they object to, which the Israeli government is doing. So they're trying to punish the Israeli government by attacking civilians. Sorry, so that was a long answer to say that a subset of these cases are referred to as terrorism in State Department documents. Not quite the same thing as designating. In fact, it's quite short of designating. But the Israelis have now been contemplating actual designation because they also have a mechanism that looks a bit like the American one.
But how would they identify a particular group? I mean, are these... First of all, give us a few examples. Some of these stories have been in the news lately, some of these incidents, these price tag incidents. Can you give us a couple of examples of ones that have happened recently so that people who are not familiar with it might have a better idea of what we're talking about?
Sure. Well, it's been in the news lately because a whole host of different phenomena which sort of look alike have been bunched up together. So very recently, the most sensational cases, which really aren't exactly price tag, have been attack, probably a racially or nationally motivated attack in Jerusalem of Jewish teenagers against two or three Arab teenagers, and really bad beating. But this is, of course, not organized. This is not organized in the same sense. There was something that also very severe, which was actually outside Jerusalem in a settlement called right near Bat Ain, where a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a civilian taxi, a Palestinian civilian taxi. And reports
the people involved in that were very young.
It looks like they were very young. They were young teenagers. And it looks like the Israeli authorities probably know who it was, but we're talking about very young teenagers. But there are other instances that are much more fit what we describe as the price tag, or has been known as price tag sort of phenomenon. Often it's low-level attacks against property, burning of property, cutting down olive trees in particular, some of them very old olive trees, defacing mosques. There's even been a very recent attack against a church, an old monastery actually inside Israel. It's not in the settlements at all. This is out west of Jerusalem on the road to Tel Aviv, a very famous Catholic monastery called in Latun. But
And
it's
the
become a
and
routine kind of attack against property, against civilians, against religious symbols. There will be stonings. It's become very routine. Again, it's low level. It's very different from what we would usually think of as ostentatious sort of cases of terrorism. But they've become so severe that have made the lives of a lot of innocent civilians in Area C in the West Bank, and sort of they've harassed the daily lives of them to a very large degree.
now, would you say that the majority of these are fueled by nationalism, ultra-nationalism, by religious messianic belief? Is there some combination of that going on?
Well, the particular brand of nationalism that we see associated with these kinds of settlers, and it's not just these settlers, it's a much, much broader set of settlements, most of them peaceful, vast majority of them are peaceful. But in general, this is a strand of Israeli society that is both religious and very nationalist. It's often known as national religious, or the Leumi in Hebrew. And it's a brand of Zionism that, unlike traditional mainstream Zionism, which was actually very left-wing and very socialist, David Ben-Gurion was leader of, the founder of Israel was the leader of the Labour Party, or the predecessor of the Labour Party. This strand of Zionism is religious Zionism, and it sees the settlement of the land of Israel, including especially the West Bank, where a lot of the holiest sites lie, the settlement of the land of Israel as a central religious commandment and as the central role of Zionism and as the creation of the Jewish state. So they don't view the Jewish state as some classic labor Zionists would, as basically a national homeland in national terms, but something that's intimately tied to religious aspects of a revival of Jewish sovereignty. And I should again just distinguish, this is also very different from much more orthodox types, ultra-orthodox as we call them in Israel, which are tend to be much less nationalist. So it's sort of a sweet spot between orthodoxy, Jewish orthodoxy, and nationalism, and the merger of the two after 1967 has created a brand of Zionism that is very prominent in the settler movement. But as I said before, vast majority of national religious oppose violence against civilians, of course, but it has become a breeding ground also for extremism, some of it,
Right.
which takes a variety of kinds.
So to the extent that it has become a breeding ground for extremism, is there a strand of religious fervor that either does or would seem to justify violence against Palestinians? Because obviously, I mean, you see violence perpetrated against Palestinians, but are the perpetrators operating from a vantage point where they've taken religious teachings and used them to justify that action?
To a certain degree, yes, and we highlight the fact that there are religious leaders, even rabbis, which I'm Jewish, and I find that very shameful, that they use Jewish tradition to justify these kinds of acts. Some at the very extreme even questioning the sanctity of life of non-Jews, which goes completely against the teaching of almost all interpretations of Jewish tradition.
Right.
And so that certainly exists, and that's on the sort of the periphery of national religious activism, I suppose. Again, most national religious rabbis would certainly oppose this for a variety of different reasons, including simply the sanctity of life. But it has become more prevalent, and we think that we advocate a tougher stance against this. We think that mainstream rabbis, mainstream religious leaders, and the government officials need to come out very strongly against this. And some of the rhetorical stances have been good, even recently, after the attack in Jerusalem on the teenagers, after the Molotov bomb in the West Bank and Gush Etzion. Senior Israeli leadership, President, Prime Minister, and down, have come out very strongly against it. But nonetheless, there's sort of this inability to stop the events on the ground, although Israeli forces obviously capable of doing this in terms of just the size of the force.
Well, what's the dynamic there? Because, you know, if you look at, so recently there's been, if for people who follow these issues, this situation closely, there's been an increased amount of attention on the role of the IDF in the settlements. For example, the group Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former IDF soldiers, have been producing videos and giving tours to people and trying to expose the things that they had to do as IDF soldiers in the West Bank, that they, are coming out and expressing their opposition to, which may involve themselves committing violence against Palestinians or standing by when settlers commit violence against Palestinians. How does that play a role in what you were talking about in the piece?
Well, we sort of describe a basic anomaly, and it's an anomaly of military rule in a civilian area. And sort of it's inherent to the structure. So we don't ascribe any special malice to the leadership of the IDF or even the Israeli political leadership. They're not interested in these kinds of attacks. And in fact, as we described, the whole dynamic of these attacks is to oppose Israeli policy. It's an attempt to shape Israeli policy using violence, hence the term terrorism. But the IDF is in charge of most aspects of daily life in what's known as Area C, which is the majority of the area in the West Bank that is still under full Israeli control, both civilian and military. And unlike Area A, which is under full Palestinian Authority control in terms of civilian life. The security aspects for the main security objective for the IDF, perhaps naturally, or sort of by its structure, is to defend Israel and Israeli civilians. And Israeli citizens include settlers, who are all Israeli citizens but live in the West Bank. But the West Bank, unlike Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, which were also taken in the War of '67, the West Bank has never been annexed to Israel. So that means that Israeli civilian law doesn't apply there, even under Israeli, officially under Israeli law. And so the ones in charge there are not the civilian courts or the civilian authorities. It's actually the military for the most part. The military finds itself in a very difficult situation where it's asked basically to police a large territory and to try and manage a whole host of aspects of daily life while maintaining its main objective, which is defense and security, and especially security of Israeli civilians. Our point is that with the peace process frozen and with every expectation being that this situation of military rule, at least in Area C, is going to continue for quite a while. If that's the case, then it's incumbent on Israel to make sure that the IDF is able to fulfill its full role in territory, which unfortunately is not only defending Israeli civilians, but defending all civilians in the territory, including Palestinians. And that this is deeply in the interest of Israel. Of course, it's in the interest of Palestinians and the inhabitants there, but that Israel can't shirk its obligation of policing the territory, making sure that Israeli citizens, settlers, don't abuse the protection of the IDF to attack innocent civilians under a territory which Israel is officially fully in control of.
So if there's no civilian authority in the West Bank,
in Area C,
is an Israeli who commits an act of violence against a Palestinian or an act of vandalism against Palestinian property, are they prosecuted, or is there no mechanism for prosecuting them, or is there no will to prosecute them? I guess that's the...
There certainly are mechanisms. Just to be precise, there is, of course, civilian authority. The Palestinian Authority is in charge of civilian aspects in Area B and in fact, of security aspects in Area A. But in Area C, Israel is still in full control. All aspects of life are under Israeli authority there, and all the settlements in the West Bank are in Area C. There are no settlements under the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
Rule.
Right.
In Area C, there are legal mechanisms. The police is involved. The civilian police is involved in criminal acts among settlers, especially among themselves. And Israeli civilians personally are under the purview of Israeli law by court decision. But the territory in general is under military rule. So just an example to illustrate it. If you want to build a house anywhere in Israel, there's a variety of permits you need to get, just like anywhere else. And at the end of the day, these permits go up to the Minister of the Interior, who's just in charge of these affairs, as you would in many countries. If you live in a settlement in the West Bank, the final authority goes through officers, through military officers, even if you're just building a house in a settlement. And at the end of the day, it would come up to the Minister of Defense, which is a very different mechanism than the Ministry of Interior. So in terms of law enforcement, what this means is that many of these aspects are under the purview of the IDF, which is primarily a military, it's not a police force, and of the Israeli security force, the Shabak, also known as the Shin Bet, which is sort of the internal intelligence service, somewhat like the Israeli FBI. The Israeli police will get involved in cases among settlers, but we have this gray zone where, although the authority exists, it requires a lot of coordination, it requires a great deal of political will to exercise the control in the territory, and especially when we're discussing the relations between settlers, Israeli citizens, and non-Israeli citizens, Palestinians who live in Area C, who are governed by a different set of law. And this anomaly of military rule, and especially of prolonged military rule, that we're not expecting to change anytime soon, requires a great deal of political will to make sure the situation remains under control.
Well, in his recent book, The Unmaking of Israel, Gershon Gorenberg talks about this phenomenon and talks about how very few of these instances are actually prosecuted, that extremist settlers get away with this sort of activity, it's a function both of a lack of will and the way the system is set up in terms of having this military rule there. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, if you would see violence inside Israel, you wouldn't need a great deal of political will to simply enforce the law. For example, the attack in Jerusalem, which was probably racially motivated, there is a very normal mechanism to deal with this, which is the police. And the minister in charge is the Minister of Internal Security, which is the Minister of Police, basically. And they deal with that in the normal sense. There's a court for that. There are all the regular things that you would see with any kind of attack. It could happen in the U.S. as well. Unfortunately, we have racially motivated attacks in the U.S. as well. And they're dealt with in the regular system. In the West Bank, in Area C, we have a different situation. We have a situation where most of the civilian mechanisms are not automatically employed. And what we have is a military that's trying to do too much, something that it's not really set up to do. Mm-hmm. Some of the high-level officers, I should say, have been very wary of this kind of attacks. In fact, the general in charge of the West Bank right now, the commander of the Central Command of Israel, has himself called these acts of terrorism and is very well aware of the danger of this kind of activity. So have others, including members of the right-wing government, are very wary of this. But the structure in the West Bank is such that a great deal of political will is needed, and much more is needed in terms of prosecution. The Israeli authorities need to, in a sense, get their act together and be able to prosecute the majority of these cases and treat them with the same kind of firm hand that they would if they were happening inside Israel. In the past, Israel has been able to avoid a bit of this because it always assumed that the situation in Area C is temporary, in the sense that one way or another, the situation is going to emerge. Either Israeli rule is going to be fully enforced in some of these areas under a peace deal, or, for the most part, some of these areas will become Palestinian and they will have their own law. Right now, we're looking at a peace process completely stalemated. No one is expecting a resumption anytime soon, and even if it was resumed, we're not looking at a final status agreement anytime soon. And so Israel, in a sense, the status quo, which is not static, is probably going to continue for quite a while. And under this current situation, it's very important that we prevent backsliding. We prevent the situation from deteriorating further, making the resumption of peace talks even harder, whether they look anything like the previous peace process or not. Any kind of diplomatic resolution of the issue depends on a livable condition for both societies in the territory itself. And Israel has found itself in a situation where it needs to employ much more political will and much more coordination among its law enforcement and security apparatuses so that it can enable a peaceful situation.
Would an increase of political will to crack down on this sort of violent extremism, would that have the effect of further entrenching these people who are extremists and making them even, well, I mean, I don't know if they could be more resistant to the peace process than they already are, but would it make it even more difficult in terms of the settlers' reaction to an effort to revitalize the peace process, which I think a lot of people think is virtually dead?
Well, dead or not, some kind of change on the ground is probably going to happen eventually, and this problem doesn't go away whether the peace process looks anything like it did in the past or not.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel's going to have to deal with it one way or another, and the Palestinians and the U.S. as well. The extremists have probably overplayed their hand. Part of what they did is they attacked, since the real target of what they're trying to do is the Israeli authorities. They're not trying basically to deal with the Palestinian Authority. They're attacking Palestinians, civilians, so as to pressure the Israeli government and the Israeli military to abstain from doing things that they object to, especially dismantling settler outposts, which are illegal even under Israeli law. And they've overplayed their hand in the sense that in the process of doing this, they've attacked the Israeli military itself sometimes, not soldiers, not threatening the lives of soldiers, but they attack the property of Israeli military bases, and in fact come in and vandalize Israeli military bases, which is a crossing of a red line in Israeli mentality. And they've even attacked, again, property, not the lives, but attacked the property of settler leaders, including a very prominent leader. We mentioned this in the Foreign Affairs piece, named Zev Hevel, who's actually the main person behind the establishment settlement construction effort, the effort to enlarge the settlements. So he has been a target, actually, of the extremists who are trying to prevent the kind of cooperation that he leads between the settlement establishment and the state. What this means is that the settlement establishment itself, the main leaders of the settlers in the West Bank, have come out now, finally, quite forcefully against these kinds of phenomena. Most notably, someone named Danny Dayan, who's become recently more famous in the U.S. He had a piece in the New York Times recently. He's chairman of what's known as the Yesha Council, which is the council of the settlements in what's known in Hebrew as Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Formerly, there are no settlements anymore in Gaza. Danny Dayan has, in fact, spoken very forcefully about this phenomenon and called on mainstream settlers to come out against it, and really a mea culpa of their silence against this phenomenon. This is an opportunity. This means that the Israeli authorities can now use this kind of break between the most radical extremists, the ones that we are referring to in the piece, some of whom are indulging in what essentially we believe is terrorism, and the vast majority of settlers, including the settler institutions, the establishment of the settler leadership, which is opposed to this. And so, of course, there's always risk when you're confronting extremist groups. There's always risk that they will become more entrenched. But they are so beyond the pale, these groups, that is a risk that must be taken. And moreover, when the current mood, where the main settler leadership is very much opposed to them, it's an opportunity to break between the vast majority of settlers who are peaceful, whether one likes the settlements or not, and the minority who are also very violent.
But what would be the impact, practically speaking, of forcing this break between the settlement establishment, for lack of a better word, and these extremists who are engaged in terrorist acts? In what way would that, how could that be used to advance, or make progress in the peace process? Because, I mean, even if the settlement establishment denounces violence, they're still not in favor of the peace process, right? I mean, they still don't want to, are adamantly opposed to dismantling the settlements.
Well, we're not saying that. Yeah, I mean, our point is the pieces. I should be very clear. Is neither about settlements nor about the peace process per se. We think that not stopping these kinds of attacks is a terrible step if we ever hope to resume the peace process. But more importantly, and this is the main point, even if we're not expecting to resume peace process anytime soon, if we think that the current situation is going to continue for quite a while, and that's what most observers think, then it's essential the situation on the ground be livable, and be livable for everyone on the ground, including Palestinians under Israeli control. So irrespective of whether it actually advances the peace process by confronting this violence, we have to do it. It's right in its own right. The Israelis have to do it, and the U.S. should do the steps that it can to support that. I also do think, and Dan Byman and I argue, that these kinds of attacks also lessen the possibility of resumption of any kind of talks, again, whether they look like the old peace process or not. in that they embolden the extremists on the Palestinian side. They make it much easier for terrorists on the Palestinian side to justify their attacks, and they make the more moderate leadership in Ramallah, as opposed to the leadership in Gaza, look weak, look unable to defend its own civilians in the West Bank, even though it has relations with Israel. And so it's essential to stop these, first and foremost, in its own right, because violence is wrong, obviously, but also because not doing so, I don't know if it guarantees that we can resume the peace process, but it certainly makes it much harder.
But do the, what we're calling the settlement establishment, do they actually have control over these extremists who are engaging in these price tag attacks? Because I wonder what so there's no, we discussed the lack of a good civilian mechanism to prosecute these. I mean, it seems like the price tag people are out of control, and who can control them? And can the settlement establishment control them?
Well, a central point that we make in the piece is that there used to be an authority, a sense of authority within the settler establishment, within the settler community, by the traditional leaders, including the leaders of Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful, which was the core of the national religious settlers who viewed the settlement project as both a religious and a nationalist cause. They had much more authority over their fringe than they do today. There were cases in the past. I mean, we should be clear about this. There was something called the Jewish Underground in the 80s, which committed much more ostentatious terrorist attacks, but these were the small minority among the settler community, and by and large, the leadership of the settler movement was able to collaborate with the IDF to keep the most extreme elements at bay. They've lost some of this control, and part of the reason is that the settler movement is much larger than it used to be. But another reason that we point to is what's perceived among settlers as a deep failure of the state of Israel, but also of the settler leadership in the evacuation of the Gaza Strip, the settlements and the military bases in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli government in 2005. And when the Israelis under Ariel Sharon did this and pulled out of the Gaza Strip, there was a sense of deep betrayal among rank-and-file settlers, and especially among the younger and more extreme elements that have now morphed into this Hilltop Youth that engage in price tag. And they lost faith both in the state, both in the sanctity of the state, which was actually a central element of the ideology of Gush Emunim, of the Bloc of the Faithful, but also in the ability of the traditional leaders of Gush Emunim and the settlements themselves to advance the cause of settlement, of the way they saw settlements and how they should advance with the state. And so this breakdown of authority means that it's much harder now to control the extreme elements among settlers through the mainstream leadership, which was much more possible in the 80s and even parts of the 90s. And with this breakdown, it means that the Israeli authorities need to deal this through law enforcement and through counter-terrorist measures, which are imminently possible. The Israeli legal system is capable of dealing with this, and there are all the legal apparatuses in place. But they need to do it, and they're not always doing it. There is a bit of a change now because of the very recent attacks. There seems to be a change, and some of it is not in the news. Some of it is the security establishment, especially the Shabak, dealing with it somewhat differently. But the resources need to be devoted to this. And part of the reason it's not devoted so far is that the Israeli authorities are sort of preoccupied with very different kinds of threats. First and foremost, with Palestinian terrorism, which was rampant in the beginning of the millennium, or the current century, and was brought under control through a variety of means, not only Israeli. And this, of course, has remained a primary object of them. There's a whole section of the Shabak, of the Shin Bet, which is devoted to Jewish violence. It's known as the Jewish section, in fact. And they are preoccupied with Jewish terrorism and Jewish attacks. But primarily, they're trying to stop the most dramatic cases, such as a recurrence of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, where a Jewish Israeli assassinated the prime minister. That's the main focus. What we're saying is that they have to also enlarge their focus to include this low-level kind of violence against innocent Palestinians. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. So is it your sense that the numbers of the Hilltop Youth, the people who are engaging in the price tag violence, are growing? I mean, that was, it seems, you're suggesting that the recent incident involving the 12 and 13-year-old with the Molotov cocktail might have been a wake-up call, perhaps, in particular because of the youth of the perpetrators. But I mean, how much have the numbers of these young people who are doing this? Is there any metric, any way of measuring whether their numbers have increased over the past, several years? Are they becoming more radical? And if so, do you think the longer Israeli authorities wait, the harder it will be to pull them back?
There is an element of time working against us, against all of us. It's very hard to, of course, measure them because the definition is very loose. So when we refer to Hilltop Youth, sometimes people include in that the young settlers who go out of the old settlements and establish what we know as outposts, often against even Israeli regulations. So they're illegal even under Israeli law. And that's sometimes called Hilltop Youth, and that's where the name comes from. Not all of them are violent necessarily, and of course not all of the violent extremists are necessarily of these hilltops. Some of them come from established settlements, or as we saw in central Jerusalem, not necessarily of settlements at all. And what we do know is that there's a very worrying growth in the number of incidents. Both the ones that make the news in the U.S., like the ones we've seen very recently, but also just much more routine cases that don't make the news in English often, but are reported in the Hebrew press, and sometimes not even there, of attacks against property, especially Palestinian property. Olive trees have become sort of a symbol, but also just general attacks against passing Palestinian cars and Palestinian civilians. So much so that today we would estimate that there are more attacks against Palestinian civilians than against Jewish civilians. And so the concern about terrorism against Israelis, which is a very real concern and could easily come back with a vengeance soon, is actually not the primary threat that we see right now. The primary threat that we see, at least right now, is attacks against Palestinian civilians. So we see a growth, and we especially see a continued change in the demographic of the settlement community, it's large by now. It's over 300,000, excluding East Jerusalem. And so among this very large population, most of which is suburbanites who live in settlements outside Jerusalem or essentially outside Greater Tel Aviv in some areas. But among them, you have a growing number, probably a few hundred or just a few thousand, who are outside the control of the settler establishment, who are engaged in this kind of activity, where they're just lawless kind of establishing their outposts on the hilltops, or even violent acts. And this growth of this kind of phenomenon, we fear, will create already is creating a growing sense of legitimacy of these kinds of attacks. So we can't tie, I can't tie any direct link between any one group and the Molotov cocktail bomb thrown by very young teenagers in Gush Etzion near Jerusalem. But I can say that the sense of legitimacy of these kinds of attacks certainly plays a role in the way society reacts to these things. And our hope is that these cases might be watershed in the sense that they are so extreme and they are putting a spotlight on them, that they're a bit of a wake-up call for the Israeli authorities and even the settler leadership itself, as we've seen recently.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the piece is the sense of apathy almost among Israelis living in Israel about just the peace process in general, or the lack of a peace process in general, and the settlements. And is there any evidence that this uptick in violence, or perhaps something that we're seeing also, an uptick in the reporting of certain kinds of cases, as you say, not all of them, but, I think maybe the 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids. Is there any public opinion polling or evidence that this is this is causing a change among mainstream Israelis and how they see not just the violence by extremist settlers, but just the entire occupation.
No, I don't think there's much of a change in Israeli attitude towards the West Bank in general, towards the Palestinians, not just in the West Bank. We have seen in the past month a general outcry against these kinds of cases. The school year, for example, started with a discussion of the teenagers' attack in Jerusalem itself, which nationally all schools in Israel did that, which is commendable. And the Israeli leadership, including the president, Shimon Peres, but also the prime minister, Netanyahu, and many other ministers, very strongly condemned these cases. Netanyahu called the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, to condemn the Molotov cocktail attack and to promise that Israel will treat it seriously. But the apathy towards the Palestinians is much deeper, unfortunately. It's not about simply the plight of Palestinian civilians or violence against them or the settlements. It is much deeper and has its roots at least as far back as September 2000, with the breakdown of the Camp David the Camp David negotiations with the Palestinians, and especially, most importantly, with the start of the Second Intifada in September 2000. And the general mood in Israel is very strong is very skeptical of the possibility of resuming peace talks with the Palestinians. There's a sense, right or wrong, among the Israeli public that Israel negotiated in good faith, and that the response of the Palestinians in 2000 was a pretty horrific wave of terrorism against Israelis all over, not just the West Bank and Gaza, but also Israel itself, in Jerusalem and inside Israel. And then followed by the unilateral disengagement in Gaza that I mentioned earlier. In Israeli psyche, again, right or wrong, the sense is that Israel did what everyone had always been asking Israel to do, which is to remove all the settlements and remove all soldiers and all military installations till the last millimeter of the Gaza Strip. And the response that the Israelis view to this was not just many years of thousands of rockets on southern Israel from Gaza, but also the election of Hamas and then the takeover of Hamas in Gaza. So the Israelis look at Gaza and they say this is the result of unilateral disengagement, and they look at the general situation in the Second Intifada and say that was the result of an attempt to negotiate. And they've become just completely skeptical about any kind of movement forward with Palestinians, be they the variant of Abbas or Fayyad, and certainly if they're Hamas who even officially oppose any kind of settlement with Israel ever. And so I wish I had more optimistic news about the effect of this kind of violence on general Israeli attitudes. But the truth is that this Palestinian question is quite low on Israeli minds right now. Iran and the changes in the Arab world, and especially in Egypt, are far higher than the Palestinian situation. And from the common Israeli perspective, the Palestinians sort of proved the point that they are not interested in peace, and there's almost this unwillingness to engage in that again, unfortunately.
Do you have the sense of whether it's having any impact on either American policymakers or American public opinion, to the extent that Americans are paying attention to this level of detail of what's going on there?
Yes, there is. As I said, the State Department does report this, and they report this annually for quite a while. I should say commendably. And moreover, recently, we have experienced interest from some people in the administration. I mean, the administration has long had a standing view. Most people, and the Israelis too, have a long-standing view that these kind of attacks are terrible and they are detrimental to everyone's interests, including Israel's. But to tell you this is, first and foremost on anyone's agenda, that would be far from the truth. There are so many different issues, including in the Middle East, including on Israel's different fronts, that this is certainly not first and foremost among them. And our main point is to say that even if other issues are extremely important, and the question of what Israel might do with Iran, or where the Iran nuclear program might go, and certainly changes in Egypt and in Syria, these are all terribly important. But we're also, precisely because the Palestinian issue is now low on the agenda of most Israelis and the Israeli leadership, precisely because of that, we're expecting to see a continuation of something along the current lines in Area C. And if that's the case, then it's essential that the situation in Area C not get even worse, and not make Well, to be honest, even those who support the settlements should be very concerned with what this does to the image of settlers inside Israel and certainly abroad. Not that it can get much worse. And so we think that precisely because this is low on everyone's agenda, including the U.S. agenda, it must be higher, that it needs to be dealt with, and it can be dealt with. It's something the Israelis know how to do, and the Americans can help in rather simple ways.
Well, this has been really interesting, and I appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to talk with me about it.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.